but YouTube Studio is like having me some problems. All right, looks like we're live now. Uh, are we? I think so. All right, cool. So we had like a little back and forth on Twitter over my position that there is such a thing as free will, and like I'm not sure. Is your position that where man's choices are completely determined, like there is no such thing as choice, or is your like, are you merely just you don't think it's been proven that there is free will?
Yeah, so thanks for asking. I think it's a really important distinction to make. And mine is that there is an adequate basis to believe positively in a free will rather than that I can disprove free will. So it's a similar argument. You may hear me over, I don't know where exactly the conversation will go, but you may hear me say something to the effect of like, this is akin to the same kind of arguments you hear for God. So we have a lot of arguments by implication or arguments by expected outcomes, rather than we have actual, what I would consider proof or solid evidence backing the idea of free will. And, I think it might be important just in free will because there are a lot of conceptions of these terms. And I think it's really easy for us to get mired down in, us having competing understandings. So when you say, that you believe in free will, what are the bounds of that free will? What does it look like?
Um, I'll answer that in a second, but is it okay if we just turn off the cameras? It seems like I'm getting some lag on Discord's end.
Sure. Yeah, we can do that.
Apologies, my internet is I don't think up to scratch here. Yes.
Okay.
So yeah. So the objectivist notion of free will is that you are free to basically your fundamental choice is over whether or not you are actively engaging in thought, like you are focusing your mind, you are actively integrating sense data and stuff, or if you are letting your mind drift, or even worse is actively trying to not integrate sense data. You're actively you basically, one way to put it is you control how the rationality or irrationality of your focus and whether you focus or drift.
Okay. Yeah. So I've heard this conception before, but just to hear it from the horse's mouth, I want to ask you: when you're using the terms like letting and control, wouldn't this be like where wouldn't this be the operator of free will that we're talking about, rather than whether or not you do control or drift? It's the ability to choose or to let one of these things happen.
I'm not really sure I understand the question.
Yeah, so just to paraphrase, one of the things that you said was that it's kind of the ability to either actively engage our minds or to choose to let our minds drift to positively or actively think or to evade is another way to put it. And while that state is one that certainly we could describe in terms of many types of free will, the operator that's going on here is the choice. The ability to choose is the free will, not so much the specific actively thinking or engage or evading, right?
Yeah. So like I was just trying to give you like what free will means in like an objectivist sense, like like what the bounds of your choice is, right? Because I can give the it would be a separate argument as to how you substantiate that there is such a thing as choosing the activities of your mind and stuff.
Okay, yeah. Just to probe a little bit further, as far as how this is engaged with what, maybe we could debate this if we need to, but I think we agree the rest of the causal network that is our bodies in the universe. Is this ability to choose to engage thought or to evade one that is separate from that causal network, or is it directly linked to it?
It is not separate. So basically, this is like one way that you could think of compatibilism being accurate in if compatibilism is taken to mean that causality is consistent with free will, because I would absolutely say it is, because causality is like broader than this sort of mechanistic notion of antecedent factors determining descendant factors, like billiard balls and stuff like that. That is one type of causality. Now, that's one sense of speaking in causality. But causality more broadly is simply the claim that what a thing is, what its nature is, determines how it behaves. Right? It's saying that this thing has some specific nature, and it has to act according to that nature, as opposed to just acting like however which way it could, like some Humean skepticism or something like that.
Well, yeah, it's funny you brought that up because I was just about to say there is some. I mean, again, we can circle back to some of these things. I'm just trying to lay the groundwork if we need to in the future. But there is some skepticism towards that latter claim that like causality can be described in terms of natures as opposed to the antecedent causality that we were referencing earlier. But okay, that's so. So you're looking at this from the causal structures, and the nature of the will is to have the capacity to act in these ways, right?
Yeah.
Okay, awesome. Yeah, so I think there are a lot of places we could go with this. However, I think something that's important is to kind of drill onto this idea of actually. Let me just ask another question. Um, in making this causal distinction between the antecedent and what I'm going to call, uh, I guess, nature causal. I'm not sure what the term for that one is, to be honest with you. Um, these two causal views. Um, is the will or free will in this particular instance something that is, in from your perspective, separate from the antecedent causal system?
Um. Well, it's I think it's incorrect to speak of causality as being only this notion of like billiard balls, where if you know all of the initial factors that you can predict what the end result will be, right? I think that's certainly true for some things, right? If you know the initial positions of all these billiard balls and you know the force that is applied to them, then you can predict exactly where they'll end up, right? But that isn't true for all types of causality. The prime example would be humans, right? Just because whatever biological makeup I have or whatever, whatever factors, because I mean, determinists don't even know what factors are required, and they say this all the time. Whatever factors it is, just you can tally up any sort of factors you want about me. That does not imply that you can then predict exactly how I'm going to choose in the future, right? But that doesn't mean that I'm suddenly outside of the realm of causality. It's just that a lot of these deterministic arguments are based on what a physicist understands about the universe. But that's not the only way to understand it, right? Because the stuff that a physicist studies, you can indeed use this sort of predictive approach, right? It doesn't make sense to predict where planets will be and stuff like that, but it doesn't make sense to predict human action because you can't.
Okay, so let's go ahead and let's drill down into this a little bit. So I take a completely physicalist approach to the mind. I believe that everything in the mind, and every product of the mind, from consciousness to individual thoughts, wants, desires, beliefs, etc., can be boiled down to physical components. Now, I'm not going to make a distinct claim on whether that's going to be particular mental states or whether that's going to be particular mental connections. But I think the case can be made that if we have a mind, it ought to be represented in the physical world in some way. Can we agree on that?
Yeah, I would definitely agree. Like, this is what sort of differs the objectivist view on free will with like more religious views, where like there's some sort of supernatural soul which controls the body or whatever. Like, I completely disagree with that. I think it is entirely naturalistic. You can boil it down. It's going to be like material, right? It's not going to be supernatural or anything like that.
Okay. So, typically I think we would say that we could let's really crank this down to like what I think would be the floor level for discussing any aspect of neurology or the mind, which is how basal components of the brain interact with one another to produce phenomena, effects, etc. And that would be through what we would typically consider very mechanistic causal interactions. Even if we don't or can't yet, though I have hope in the future that we could adequately explain each and every part of how these systems work together, I think, could we agree at least that there ought to be an explanation to where if we are given a certain range of inputs, we ought to be able to deterministically expect a certain kind of output.
I would disagree with that. Like, and this is like you'll hear like Sam Harris and stuff talking about this, where it's like on the one hand they'll be like, oh yeah, you can determine everything. Then they'll also bring in notions of like, well, even in the physical world there are things like quantum physics, so you can't actually predict everything in the physical world. And actually, we don't actually know all these factors. We assume there's some factors though, such that you could predict human action. But these factors, it's an assumption that these factors exist. Nobody's ever discovered them. I don't think they will be discovered.
Right, but if we're going to reduce the mind to a physical system, and I'm saying reduce as in, not elevate it to the level of like a special pleading, like a dualist perspective or something like that, not to like delegitimize a physicalist perspective. But if we're going to reduce it down to the physical level and then look at it from its basic operators, if there's going to be any kind of consistency in the system, which it seems to be the case that if we have a system, there needs to be some consistency to it, then even I won't go there yet, but then we ought to be able to, with sufficient information, even just like, let's not get to thoughts, brain states, consciousness, or anything. If a certain signal enters a certain area or particular piece of the brain with enough information, we ought to be able to say with a great degree of certainty, these are going to be the outputs of that, right?
Um, I'm not sure that it does work that way. I mean, it might be the case that for certain neurological procedures, you can say that, well, given these inputs, it'll have these. We can predict some outputs, right? But that's not necessarily saying that you can apply science to this. It doesn't, because I mean, I don't think we can, with any sort of scientific accuracy, predict which choice a person's going to make, whether they think or evade, and yada yada yada. It's an assumption that we could potentially do this, but I don't see. I haven't seen that being substantiated by anyone.
Right. I guess I'm just trying to look at this from two conceptual positions where, I'm trying to look at this from extending out how other physical systems of the body work to essentially to how the mind works. Because I think to distinguish the mind from the complex operations of the immune system would essentially be a kind of special pleading. Like these things, sure, they differ in function, but they're no different in the substance, the things that comprise them at the fundamental level. And these qualia, these experiences that we have are distinct, but they are a product of these physical systems. So I'm just trying to apply that same kind of reasoning that, like, hey, we may not have been able to explain how the immune system works comprehensively, and we still probably can't to a great degree. I'm sure there's plenty of holes missing, but that doesn't mean that for some reason we couldn't.
Well, I would say there is some reason why we couldn't apply this, atomistic model or mechanistic model to human choices, and that's because it's self-defeating. It's a self-defeating position to hold determinism, right? And a self-defeating position couldn't possibly be true, right? If it's because any notion of like, oh, if we discover all these factors and stuff, that would be a notion of proving that there is deterministic laws. But any notion of proof requires that man has volition, and I think I mentioned this in the Twitter thread. If you want to like go over that.
Yeah, I did some thinking on this, and I think let me pull it up just so that I don't, no sense of going off of memory when we have the internet to catalog it all for us, right? Let me see here. Scroll back just a little bit. The idea that one thing that I'll actually, I can just do this. And while I'm pulling this up, we can go over it a little bit more. But one thing I can just concede is like, okay, yeah, maybe epistemology is dead if there is no free will. Maybe none of us will ever change our minds or anything. There is no such thing as truth. We're both here, just sitting here in complete delusion. That doesn't itself substantiate free will. Like the claim that, well, we need this thing called proof, or we need truth, or we need epistemology in general, does not therefore make free will true. Do you understand where I'm coming from?
Um, sure, but I mean, it seems like if there's going to be arguments over these types of things. If we're going to have, it seems like we've got to accept that there is such a thing as knowledge. There is such a thing as validating ideas that you hold, right? It seems like it's a stolen concept or something going on there, right? It's to say that, well, this position is an error, but the category of error requires the category of truth, which requires that we can validate our understanding of things, which requires that we have free will, right? It seems like that's a self-defeating position.
Okay, let's go through this. I've got it open right here. I don't know if you have it available for the stream or not.
I've got
But
like
it's pretty
a
much
version of the just like on my notes here.
okay. That works. So we're. I remember just to be clear, we had a little bit of a language differentiation last time. Could you just define validation for me real quick as you use it?
Sure. So to validate something is it's the job of reason, right? You validate uh, a certain belief that you have to make it knowledge, right? And the method you use to validate it is logic. So you have to like make sure it's not contradictory. It adheres to all of the evidence that you have and all this lovely stuff.
Right. Okay. So how about this? I walk me through because I'm not 100% following the criticism in a way that I feel comfortable trying to refute it. So rather than just me professing ignorant or speaking ignorantly, can you just walk me through the steps of like, okay, so we have this presupposition that knowledge requires validation. Where does free will fit into this, and how does it resolve this issue?
Sure. So to ask for proof of like any sort of claim, or or to claim that language. I don't know why I've noted it down that way. So to ask for proof of anything presupposes that man can hold erroneous beliefs, like he can think in error, or else there'd be if consciousness was automatically attuned to the truth, there'd be no need for epistemology or even caring about how man validates his knowledge, right? But on the determinist view, a man will simply hold whatever beliefs he holds without any ability to validate those beliefs, because if consciousness is automatic, then a man simply believes whatever he happens to believe, and he has no way to like deliberately choose the truth instead of this falsehood, which is required for validating anything, right? But the determinist has to accept that man can think in error, i.e., man isn't automatically attuned to the truth, because the same deterministic laws which caused him to be a determinist also caused me to believe in free will, right? So he has to hold that these deterministic laws can lead man to error. But then how exactly does the determinist validate determinism on these premises, right? Because he can't deliberately choose reality over fantasy. He can't claim anything to be knowledge. He can't make any truth claims on his own premises, because he will just believe whatever he happens to believe, right? This is a self-defeating position.
Okay, gotcha. Can I just ask for a little bit of clarification on this idea that he will simply hold whatever belief he holds with no ability to validate those beliefs? This seems to imply that even in a determinist perspective, you couldn't change effectively. That there is no ability to validate. Whereas I don't know if that necessarily follows from determinism. Could you try to help me understand that?
Well, you could change your beliefs, right? Because the determinist could hold that these deterministic laws, on Saturdays they determine you to be a determinist, and on other days they determine you to be a free will believer, right? But that doesn't mean that the fact that you can change beliefs, they can't deliberately change beliefs. They can't deliberately go through a process of validating that this belief is true, right? And then change, if it's not true, then change to the true belief, right? They will just hold whatever they hold. They couldn't even assert that what their notion of logic is correct, right? Because they couldn't even know that, if you were like a Cartesian determinist or something, I don't know if those exist, but you might be being deceived by the demon, right? The demon is determining all of your beliefs. You couldn't even know that, logic is correct, that non-contradiction is true, right? There's nothing you can know on this view. There is no such thing as knowledge on this view.
I guess the issue that I'm running into is that I'm trying to so the way that I would look at this from like a determinist perspective is like, okay, well, what if completely out of your own control you held a particular desire towards the pursuit of knowledge, right? And you have this sense data and you have the capacity to interact with the world and to compare and contrast results, and you have this capacity for rationalization. As long as you hold that desire, I don't see why you couldn't, even if not in your own volition, if through some deterministic mechanistic cause, arrive at through the same kind of processes that you do in a free will scenario. um, I don't see why we have to throw the baby out with the bathwater. You could think of this in a, you know, I'm not a programmer, but I'm imagining that you could do something to the effect of I don't know if I would consider it knowledge necessarily, but you could do a similar kind of process of this validation by creating like a function, like a reasoning machine, essentially, that just deterministically takes inputs and compares them and contrasts them, puts them through the rigor, and then creates true or false outputs from that, right?
Right, but this isn't really what validation is, right? Validation requires that you can actually deliberately apply logic, which you know to be true, not because you were determined to believe that, but because it's like axiomatic, right? It's required for thought, right? This isn't validation if it's just, you're a puppet and you're going through these steps, because how could you ever know that you're going through the correct steps of validation as opposed to incorrect ones, right? How do you know that you aren't just, applying all these ideas erroneously? Like, how would you know that, like, non-contradiction is true or the law of identity is true? You couldn't know any of these things. So how could you ever hope to say, yeah, I was determined to go through the correct process of validation, as opposed to those free will believers who went through an incorrect process of validation? Because you couldn't say that on the determinist view.
I mean, to a certain extent, these things are axiomatic. Like the law of identity and non-contradiction are proven by lack of counterexample. We don't have like the law of identity detector that we like take a picture of the universe and say like, oh look, there's no non-law of identities. It's the fact that we wake up and our mouse is still a mouse and not a Ferrari, that we derive these fundamental laws of the universe from. And I'm not. This is not to set up some ultra skepticism. I think it's completely fine to accept these things on face value as they are. But we come to these through inference, not through. We don't have like a deductive, true Platonic knowledge of identity, non-contradiction, excluded middle, etc.
Well, I would agree. It's not deductive because to say that something is you came to it through deduction is implying that you had some sort of proof. But the very concept of proof presupposes that these the laws of thought are correct, because the laws of thought are required in thinking. Hence the name, right? It's so the reason why they're axiomatic is that you'd have to accept them to do anything. You'd have to accept them to dispute that they're correct, right? This makes them axiomatic as opposed to, oh, I don't know, some random fact like the sky's blue. I don't have to necessarily accept that the sky's blue in order to dispute that the sky's blue, right?
Right. Exactly. I mean, I'm agreeing with you fundamentally. It seemed the way that you were talking about these things earlier, as if it's as if an innate Platonic true knowledge of them is a necessary component in this kind of interaction that we're having that would separate the free will from determinism. So I don't mean to steer the conversation off too far, but I don't know if that's actually how we operate with these concepts to begin with.
Well, I would say it's definitely not. It's definitely not Platonic, right? It's Aristotelian, right? It's not that.
Sorry, yeah, I'm using Platonic in a pseudo colloquial,
All right, okay.
this like ideal form.
You had to know that was going to piss me off as an objectivist, though.
Yeah. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to interrupt you. My bad.
So yeah, it's I mean, I was just going to get angry at the Platonic thing, so I suppose there isn't anything else to say there.
No, you're all right. Yeah, but I mean, just as far as the idea itself, that how we engage with these as concepts to begin with is already sort of like a non-perfect method. I mean, does that not apply any sort of wrinkle to to your relation back to the argument you were making for free will?
Well, I would say to even point this out to be a non-perfect method, like it's not perfect. Like we're not automatically tuned to truth. Like we could err. That presupposes there is such a category of you know, some ideal, some correct way to go about things. That there is this thing as truth, there is knowledge, right? So it's again, it's a stolen concept to say, well, this is it's Cartesian doubt. It's saying, well, the method of deduction and induction and stuff like that, it's not perfect, right? We can make mistakes, so therefore we can't know anything, right? But then, for there to be such a thing as error, you have to know what truth is, right? But for you to know what truth is, you have to be able to have knowledge in the first place, and to have knowledge, to be able to validate your ideas, you have to be free.
Yeah, so I guess it depends on the exact bounds of our knowledge, and it seems to be the case that we're agreeing to some extent that what would be considered, like, if we go back to the classics, what they would consider pure knowledge is something that we don't seem to have access to as, meat, as conscious beings in a meat sack. We have like a barrier between us and that, but we set up these axioms that create a framework in order for us to cope essentially with the situation that we're given, and we can from that reach what I want. Consensus conclusions is a bad term for it, but essentially we compare and contrast sense data with other creatures to find consensus, and that's how we help to account for errors that we have to implicitly recognize is within our system.
Right, but even recognizing that a human can come to error on some subject implies that humans can come to truth on some subject, right? But coming to truth on that subject, it requires validation, which requires volition.
Well, I actually don't know if that, I don't, just let me know if I'm getting too far afield. I don't mean to steer the conversation off in too far of a direction, but I don't know if knowing that well, we'll say knowing, but knowing that a human can come to error means knowing that they can come to truth necessarily. It could just be the case that uh, everything is error, and we're all just doing like a form of really well done bet hedging as far as epistemology is concerned. Now, I don't know if I hold that belief, but I'm more so challenging the perspective that it necessarily follows from the idea that we can come to error.
I mean, error is like meaningless if you don't have any concept of truth, right? Error is defined as a deviation from truth.
Oh yeah, yeah, yeah. I'm just saying the operator that I was kind of leaning on there was come to, right? So if we can come to error, then we can come to truth. Well, we can have concepts of error and truth, and for whatever reason, not be able to come to either of them.
Um, let's think about that. So you have a concept of error and a concept of truth, and yet you can't come to either error or truth.
Yeah, I mean, like let's say we lived in a world where we had perfect true sense data. We could see the things in and of themselves, which don't even begin to ask me what that would look like. Or, we live in a world of imperfect sense data where we can't grasp things in and of themselves, and that's just a part of our lives. Either one of these situations could lead us to a place where, if we have the sense data, we have absolute truth of of the thing that we're dealing with, not just the conceptual thing, but the thing itself. And the other one would necessarily put a barrier between the concepts that we hold of that thing and the thing itself.
Um,
So we could have a concept of truth and error. We could explain these things and what they would look like if we could reach them. But it doesn't mean that in the real world they act this way.
well, right, but it would be like, how could you correctly explain what it would mean to come to truth? Right, you've got a correct understanding of how that works without ever having access to correct things, right?
It could perhaps be in the same way that we try to describe infinite. We don't have access to infinite. We can't really describe the concept in any meaningful way, yet we have it. We use it as an operator. It's a functional concept. But if you just try to think about infinity right now, it's completely outside of our grasp. It could be
Well,
the case for truth.
I would say that's
Like
because, at least in the metaphysical sense, there is infinity is meaningless, right? It's fine if you just mean it goes on forever, right? And as it would pertain to like a sequence of numbers, but
yeah,
like
and I mean,
yeah.
well, I guess we could do the same thing for that. We could say that, like, okay, there's this ideal, this concept of truth that doesn't correspond to anything that us as human agents could reach in reality. We could do that if we wanted to. and just again, I feel like we're getting deep into like an epistemological rabbit hole. Just to kind of focus this back in on where we're at with the epistemological claim, my issue isn't so much that we're placing some boundaries on what can or and cannot be true in the world if free will is to exist. Like again, these implications may be the case. We may be damned to never come to truth because there is no epistemology, because we can do no validation. That nonetheless does not make the thing outside of our meat sacks, if we're going to, for the sake of the argument, accept it's there at all, which I think we both agree with. um, it doesn't justify that there's a free will there.
Right, but I mean, I suppose, like, I'm just not getting past the fact that, like, to even make this claim, to even try and claim that there is, a man has no volition, it requires these concepts of truth, right? It requires that man can validate his knowledge, right? It requires these things, and yet it says that these things are impossible, right? That's,
If How about this? So whatever statement truth corresponds to, or sorry, whatever thing a true statement corresponds to, we would consider a fact, right?
yeah,
Okay, so if there were no humans on Earth and the universe was the exact same way as it was now, would we still say that rocks are of, this type of rock is of X mineral composition? Would that still be a fact of the universe?
yeah.
So the this idea of truth may not exist in the way that we would like it to, where it's like humans can, by their own volition, come to these things. But I don't see why there's any reason that an autonomous agent is effectively in full determinism can't come up with thoughts that correspond to facts and reality that they can validate through sense data. Like, sure, we may not be able to actively change other people's minds. It's just, it could be totally determined. It may be the case that in order for me to present that to another person, that I'm engaged in some kind of performative contradiction by showing proof. But I don't think it excludes us from holding beliefs that are justified.
But I mean, it wouldn't be justified though, because these rocks, they have no epistemology. There's no rock epistemology. They couldn't
Right.
even come to these concepts, right? They couldn't prove these things. They couldn't justify their claims. But the determinist is claiming that they can justify the determinist claims, right? But then they can't, right? On their own grounds, that is.
Okay. Yeah, I think so. The idea that I was trying to get across was this idea of like the fundamental bedrock of epistemology is whether or not there are facts, which we seem to agree on. Like truth means nothing if there's not something to be true about. Um, I think we could agree on that as well, right?
Yeah.
Okay. So from there, you know what I actually did is I jumped out of the analogy without or the hypothetical without stating otherwise. But this idea that if there are no humans, there would still be rocks of X mineral composition means that the facts that underpin our knowledge aren't based on any sort of free will or anything like that. So if we apply without without a will determining us to do so, but we have a want innately through some kind of desire or through the massive causal chain, like I talked about earlier, that says, hey, I want to come to understand what rocks are made of. And we have an understanding that there's a world of facts out there that we can get to, we can access to some degree. Then I don't see why we couldn't make knowledge claims about them. Because again, I kind of want to. I know I'm running right back into the same objection again, so I want to try to help resolve it. But I guess what I'm missing is this idea that validation, that an autonomous agent cannot be either or, true or false, based on some underlying conditions that don't necessarily have to be free will. Like I feel like we could fill in the free will box with wants and desires. You have a desire to conform your ideas with reality. You have a desire to not do that, or you don't care, or something like that.
Well, I would say just having a desire, like, I'm not really sure what a desire would mean if you have no ability to, like, pursue these desires, but, like, if you just had like a computer program or something where it has a constant, and this constant says pursue truth, right? But if this, you know, if you just unleash this, like, sort of like free will zombie, right? This deterministic zombie where he has no ability to choose truth over falsehood or anything like that, right? Yeah, he might accidentally stumble across, oh, there are rocks in this world. Existence exists. He might accidentally, like, monkey on a typewriter, spit those statements out. But on this deterministic being, it would have no. It wouldn't make sense to say that he has knowledge of anything because he can't validate anything. He's just a monkey on a typewriter. He might spit out some like statements which are correct, right? And a being which does have free will could verify that these statements are correct, but this being couldn't. Like the determined being couldn't. He would have no means of doing so. So he doesn't really have knowledge of anything.
Okay, so you're saying that it could like collect all of the sense data and present like this is what I found, but it couldn't make any sort of determinations without a free agent validating it. Just to make sure I understand you.
Yeah, because like let's just even think like how could this being come to, you know, causality? Because it was in the ancient Greek world, right? It was just seen as self-evident that there are such things as miracles, right? Because there are plenty of things that the Greeks couldn't understand. They didn't have this sort of widespread sense that that there is a law of causality. That didn't come until way, way, way later, right? But that requires all sorts of notions of proof and knowledge and all these different things, right? If this determined being couldn't do any of that. Like we like to take for granted all these things, like the laws of thought. We like to take that for granted, but it really isn't obvious. It took a lot of philosophy to even get to Aristotle with the law of identity. That like it's not immediately obvious, and this determined being, would have no means of deliberately choosing truth over fantasy. So I see no way that it could possibly tend towards a correct worldview or anything. It has no knowledge. It has no means of attaining knowledge.
Okay. This is interesting actually because I just had a conversation recently with someone about artificial intelligence and knowledge. And there's some interesting writing that large language models are teasing on the idea of knowledge, and I'm kind of sympathetic to them actually, as far as having a justified belief in a concept, which sounds crazy to say out loud, and I understand that I don't want to paint myself as some AI sycophant, nor am I a computer scientist. But as someone who studies philosophy of mind, this is really interesting to me because it kind of the insinuation here, and this could also just be sloppy usage. So maybe this example won't be as helpful as I hope it is. But one way that we could think about this is the claim that's being made is like these artificial intelligence systems have access to a wide array of sense data and are constrained by certain laws of the universe and of their construction, which are necessarily going to be the kind of causal forces I was talking about earlier. So, the law of identity applies in the context of AI just as much as it does to us because it applies to the universe at whole, as far as we can tell. I'm not going to dispute identity just to make sure that's clear again, but just to stay intellectually honest. So from that, they're essentially saying that like given a sufficiently competent system with the right ability to interact with the world, it's not an impossible idea that this system, without anything that we would acknowledge as a free will, um, be able to catalog and store and thus justify this information based on other observations that it's making to establish a congruency with the universe, which is essentially what we're doing in all of everything we do, is trying to establish congruencies and resolve disputes. That's another huge one as far as like how we come to validate and I would say justify concepts. Uh, so that I'm probably not doing the greatest sales pitch for it, but if something like GPT-5 came around and it could demonstrate some real capacity for knowledge, would you consider that something kind of detrimental to your claim, or would you say that it has free will? I know I'm speaking in a pure hypothetical here, but hopefully, you know.
You know, it's fine. I would like first of all, I'd be very suspicious of any claims of like a GPT-5 or a GPT-6 having like genuine volition because these models would be loaded with millennia of human philosophy, right? Which kind of gives it a bit of a head start. You could have basically what they're going to do is they're trying to predict the next word in a sequence of words, right? If you have a bunch of human words, and it's really good at predicting what the next human words will be, right? It's going to come off all like a human, but that doesn't mean it is one, right? But maybe there is like because some people do theorize that maybe you can string together different models to like create a genuine like intelligence, right? But like maybe you can, right? Like maybe it is possible to make a computer like actually have volition, right? And in that case, yeah, I wouldn't really see that as being at all detrimental to my claim because my claim is fundamentally not that there's some soul which is required to give you intelligence. It's that no, there is matter can be intelligent. Matter can have volition, right? So it wouldn't be at all detrimental to say that well this metal can become sentient. This metal can have volition, right? Because it's all going to be based in actual material reality, right?
Okay. Um, yeah, I understand what you're saying. I just how about this? Let's if you're okay with it, maybe we could try, taking a couple steps back from where we are now, kind of where we started with this idea of um so I presented this idea of the causal nature of the universe being something that we can observe and have knowledge of. I don't think either of us dispute that, and we understand it to be so. Um, Free will would need to be some kind of system outside of that in order for it to have any sort of functional meaning. Now, you presented this objectivist compatibilism. Uh, sorry, I don't mean to strawman you. I don't know if you presented it exactly as a compatibilism, but it seems to work functionally that way.
Yeah,
Um,
it is compatibilism if compatibilism just means that free will and causality are compatible.
okay. And so we reached that point, and so now our issue is that we're not disagreeing on whether it's causal in any sort of means, but whether or not it's self-defeating to not have it, because in order for us to not have free will, we wouldn't be able to come to any sort of knowledge because we would be lacking validation, right? That's where we're at.
Sorry, I was trying to check out an audio issue. Can you repeat that?
Oh no, you're fine. Sorry, just let me know if it keeps going. I don't think I have anything crazy running in the background. My VPN is off. So yeah, but just to repeat, the last bit of it anyways, so we went from this kind of my position on the causal basis for determinism, which you said doesn't present an issue via compatibilism, and as you defined it, and that's when you presented the argument of epistemology, which is an issue for determinism because it essentially determinism denies the concept of validation, which is essential for epistemology. So there can be no proof of determinism because you are contradicting yourself by attempting to propose some validation. It's a self-defeating idea, essentially, right?
Yeah.
Okay. So I wanted to make sure that we're back on the same page because I what I'll do is I'll drop the hyper skeptical argument because honestly it's not one that I think it's an interesting argument, and I think it's one that probably could stand, but I don't know if it's really going to get to the root, especially of this kind of compatibilist as far as causality and now this epistemological issue that we've brought up. So one thing that I'd like to kind of poke at is whether or not lacking the concept of free will. Um, how do I want to put this? I'm sorry. Can you give me 1 second? I just want to make sure I don't phrase this incorrectly.
Sure.
Okay, but essentially, what I want to get at is that my ultimate, so the way I believe that the will functions, right? And maybe this could be another area that could help us drill down on maybe where I'm missing something with your epistemological concerns. The way I believe the will functions is it's a part of the conscious experience where we have these underlying faculties that we call desires that are can be brought up by a myriad of ways, that therefore the will it takes into consideration with the rest of other components of the mind. We could say reasoning, we could say reflex, instinct, etc., yada yada. These could all be like, we could take a modular perspective of the mind, if you will. And the will is the mediator between these desires and what comes out at the other end. We could say it's like the actor of consciousness. Um, and I guess this, I'm trying to tie this back to the epistemological idea in really trying to say that I don't want, we could have these desires, that we could have a desire for congruency with reality in a way that I think would give us an identical outcome to as if we had like a full, not even your position, like a full-blown libertarian, as in philosophy of mind libertarian free will, that is just completely immune to all causality and can just choose whatever it wants. Like that would be like the ultimate extent of volition, and I think would be potentially the ultimate validator if you could wield that power. But so from an outcome perspective, I think that's what I'm missing is why can we not derive this from an explanation of will acting upon a hierarchy of desires in order to achieve some end, and that end being seeking truth. I'm sorry I rambled for so long. I was just really trying to get a lot of ideas out there.
Oh, that's completely fine. It's going to happen with like one of these more philosophy heavy debates, right? It's not going to just be like, no, you're a socialist. No, you're a socialist. Nah, 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 nah. Right. But
Yeah.
I I would say this idea of will mediating between your desires and like other components of the mind and stuff like that. Sort of, I'm not sure that that is the way that the mind works, but put that, we can put that aside as like a different issue because that's sort of more psychology, right? Um, but this whole idea of mediation, that sounds a whole lot like me to like that sounds a whole lot like volition to me, right? It's there is some sort of action going on here. It's choosing how to balance out these different components, right? That would be a volition. So on this model of mind, yeah, you could have free will, right? If you have this mediation, that's completely fine. But then you could have, because you have volition there, you could come to knowledge. You could deliberately choose truth over falsehood, right?
Okay, yeah. So I think there's two ways actually that so what I'll do is I'll just ask another question. The classic. Um, so I think, yeah, I mean, I think there is a concept of free will that follows this sort of model that I am totally okay with. And I think that we could even probably come to an understanding of free will that meets this idea of volition as presented, that does compute with my understanding of how the will works, what I would typically call determinism. It's not impossible. So just to expand on the idea a little bit, basically my presentation comes pretty strongly from Galen Strawson. I think he did a lot of really good work on free will. I don't agree with all of it, but I think some of it's really compelling. I'm not sure if you're familiar with his his paper that he did, the impossibility of moral responsibility, which is where I disagree with him, by the way. But this basically he describes the will in similar terms, that the will is essentially the mediator of desires, and the volition in this case is a lot like it would be the same kind of mediation that, if you follow a modular theory of mind, the perception module mediates raw sense data from the eyeball, the electrical impulses, into a perceivable thing for your conscious being, right? That's the kind of mediation that we're talking about when it comes to the will. It would be like, it's sloppy to think about this, but maybe just for conceptual sake, it's worth saying. The will could be essentially a will module in this modular theory of mind, that we pump desires into, and we pump sense data into, and then it has a set of processes that it uses to evaluate these on a hierarchical level that gives us the output of action.
It, so is it like, is it just like a function, right? Is it just like, is it like deterministic? We could say, is it like given some set of inputs, it will always have the same output, or can it like vary its output on some sort of volition, right?
I think, well, obviously, I'm inclined to immediately agree to the determinants, because I believe fundamental units of the mind ought to be explained deterministically. Therefore, larger structures of the mind ought to be explained deterministically. Um, there doesn't seem to be necessarily some kind of grounds for emergent properties from constituent components that can't be explained by the components. But just to entertain the idea, just to work through it, rather, not to sound like I'm blowing it off, because I'm legitimately interested in it. So whenever you say it could change, could it change? Uh, I think, well, I think I have to stop myself there. I think if my understanding of the mind is to hold any water, then it would have to be the case that if all variables were the same, if we were to roll back the clock, and we were to do everything the same, the exact same inputs under the same contexts in the same temporal space, spatio-temporal environment, if you'd prefer that, it would have to be the case that the same thing would occur. Um,
I mean, it's not necessarily like um false that the same thing would occur, right? Because that could just be they're making the same choice. That doesn't negate that it is a choice being made, right? Because the choices I'm making, um, this might be not correct, but I don't see why it couldn't be the case that my current ability to think or or evade, right? If I've done a bunch of evading in the past, I'm not going to be as apt to think as like Ayn Rand resurrected right now, right? If I've been evading my entire life, I'm going to have this whole house of cards built up from all these problems I've been pushing away from my mind. So I'm going to have like a habit of doing this, right? So you can maybe, so like in that sense, you can you could predict that Hegel is more likely to evade than Ayn Rand, right? You could predict that, but that doesn't mean that you can, like, as a scientist, you can get in there and you can say, we know exactly when Ayn Rand's going to think, when she's going to drift, and when she's going to evade over the next 10 years, right? That is what you can't do, because there is still some choice there, right? At any point, Hegel could, make a turn in his life and choose to go on a better path. He probably won't, because he's a arch evader, right? But he could. We don't know. But also,
okay,
I
so
wanted to sort of
okay.
clear something up. Like you said in there that all of the actions of or the behavior of all these different components, it has to be explainable by their nature, and I would completely agree. But that does not negate that there could be some choice in there, right? Because this is what I'm saying is that causality and free will are not incompatible, right? You can have choice, and that is explained by the nature of the thing which is choosing.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. I wanted to focus on something in particular you said, because I thought it was kind of interesting. So back to ripping on Hegel, because I fucking love doing that. Oh,
Oh, yeah.
sorry. Can I curse on here? I'm sorry.
Yeah, you can curse.
Okay. Yeah.
I said way worse.
Back to
Don't worry
ripping
about
on.
it.
Back to ripping on Hegel. So we could agree that Hegel had no want to write competent philosophy, right? But if he were to, if he, so someone asked in the comments, if you don't mind me addressing it real quick, like where the whole wants and desires thing come from, because I think it might make my next point a little more clear. These aren't like feelsy things. The ideas are that these are operators in the mind. These are the things that you derive choice from, right? Like the phenomenon we call choice, whether it's free choice or whether we want to come up with some other term later or understanding as the conversation develops. This is like what we would colloquially refer to choice is where it comes from. You can only do the things you have a want or desire to do. If you didn't have a want or desire to do, you couldn't make an intentional action to do them. You would have no real capacity to, even if it's a spur in the moment. This is kind of like it's not one to one, but I think it's very close to Mises's kind of human action formulation, in the sense that we're going to do what we want to do, and we can only do effectively what we want to do. And all of these are done on a hierarchical scale, and they're weighed based on the context of the situation, which is one of the arguments that the will is involved with that. Strawson, for example, breaks these down into first order desires and second order desires. But he, this kind of is going in the direction of my question. If we grant free will to Hegel and say that he wanted to, start writing good, rigorous philosophy, what exactly does that process look like as far as him, developing this want? Does the will come in and inject the want of its own capacity, or does the want already exist and the will selects it and drags it up?
I, I would say like these emotions, these wants, these desires you have, they aren't just arbitrary, like, they just came from nowhere. They came from your prior thought or from your prior evasion, right? If I am thinking a lot, if I am engaged in correct identification of an integration of sense data, if I'm doing that a whole lot, then my emotions will correctly correspond to what they should be, right? So what it would look like for Hegel, because he's been doing a whole lot of evasion, his emotions would be all out of whack, right? But then he could start going, okay, right, we're going to actually sit down, we're going to actually start looking at reality, and we're going to start correctly integrating reality. It's almost like he's going to go through like a bust cycle, right? There's going to be like a painful, switch which is flipped as his house of cards falls, and then he can start like actually building something true. He can start acting on truth. His emotions can actually correspond with reality. I might have butchered the objectivist understanding of emotions there, because I haven't actually specifically researched that part, but that seems to make sense to me. It's that the emotions aren't arbitrary, like they came from your prior thought or from your prior evasion.
Yeah, and I think from my perspective, I don't believe wants and desires to be arbitrary either. I think they're, direct consequences of any number of factors potentially. Great example is the want to eat food, or the desire to eat food, comes both from a biological impulse telling you, hey, you've got to eat, and the desire to not want to die. Right, because theoretically speaking, if you had a desire to die more so than to eat, you could just override. The hierarchy would work in a way that you would just not eat and you would die. I think we could debate that. The biological impulse might be too strong, but for the case of framing this,
Well, certainly have been some monks who have like basically starved themselves in the past, so that's definitely correct that you can overcome these impulses.
Yeah, and so with this perspective, whenever we want to change something, so say like we want to change, right? Well, in order to do that, we would have to want to change. And if we're going to make this into a process of the volition of will, rather than these kind of coming up through other causal means outside of the will, we run into an issue of essentially an infinite regression, where in order to want to change, you have to want to change, and you have to want to change, and want to change. And not to be obnoxious, but that's essentially the idea that we're working with here. If this sort of model, as many, particularly connectionists, apply to the mind, holds any water, it seems to be the case that to have the ability to modify your wants in an actionable manner, you would have to essentially do so in an infinite regress, which I don't think is how we intuitively or explicitly talk about the function of choice.
Well, I suppose my issue with that would be that it's assuming that uh, emotions have primacy here. Like it's just your whims have the primacy. I disagree with that. I think your thoughts, your like emotions, all these things, whatever you want to call them, like what you want, I think that is determined by is determined by your prior thought or your prior evasion. You will want to do things which you should want to do if you have correctly integrated past sense data. Right? You will want to continue living as opposed to dying if you have been using your mind properly. If you've been evading reality and you think it's all just a nothingness and it's actually bad for you and all these other horrible errors that you can fall into, then you're going to want. It's not that you want to change. It's that you have directed your mind in such a way that your emotions do change in some way, right? They align with how you have been previously thinking or evading, right?
If we so just to play with this idea a little bit, if we lived forever, in the limit, we'll say in the limit, we'll use this in math terms because like I was talking about earlier, infinity is this horrible concept to work with. Like in the limit, if we were to have this limit style number of thoughts, will we eventually not just wind up in a position to where we've created an unbreakable pattern for ourselves, essentially? Like we've chosen our way into determinism to where we've reinforced our behavior to the extent that there's no way to break that?
I don't see how we would have these unbreakable patterns.
Well, I'm just kind of going off of the idea that you were talking, maybe I misunderstood, but this idea of like our prior thoughts or evasions are informing how we're going to think or evade in the future. And so if we evade, if we trend line towards evading more, the more we evade, and limit the possibility of us engaging in thinking, which is how we kind of explained the Hegel thing earlier, then in the limit, wouldn't we reach a point where we've made the possibility for thinking, if we've relied too much on evading, functionally zero or zero in the limit?
I don't think that necessarily is true. I think it can be simultaneously true that it's more difficult for grand evaders to ever think than it is for grand thinkers to think, right? And that this can't just carry on forever. Like there very well could be some limit to this, right? Where uh I wouldn't want to establish necessarily say numbers to it, but you could say that like there's a limit of 10 evasion, right, that you could possibly get to, and then you can't have any more proclivity towards evasion than that, right? Maybe that's the case, right? But that's obviously going to be highly metaphorical. You can't really assign numbers to these things, right?
Right. And on one hand, I want to be the pedantic philosopher and say like, well, I mean, that's kind of like a bare assertion to some extent, right? But on the other hand, I do want to agree with you in the sense that like I don't believe we could assign a number even with this system to how many. It could be the case that it varies between individuals, or that maybe there is no limit. But the idea is that I'm really trying to poke at is that I don't know if we can conclusively say, and this is not a proof either way, but perhaps just a little bit of doubt, that we couldn't wind up in a sense where we've chosen ourselves into determinism as far as our thinking or evading is concerned.
Well, maybe that is the case, right? But it would require these like immortal beings, which um, whether or not that's the case for immortal beings, I think it's sort of outside the question of whether or not for regular humans do they have free will, right? And like
Yeah,
I would
that's
say
fair. That's fair.
I would say probably still for these immortal beings they still do have choice. It's just that they've been massively shifted into one mode of thinking, which probably is the case, right? If you just live forever, you probably do get into like habits and stuff like that, and these habits could be reinforced over millennia. That doesn't mean that you couldn't ever break these habits, right?
Right, right. Okay, I kind of ruined my own train of thought there. So, I mean, not that it wasn't an interesting tangent to go down. Sorry, I don't mean to imply that. Just that going back to where we were with how choice integrates into this kind of want desire hierarchy. Just to make sure I understand you and I didn't completely lose it. So your objection is essentially that this thinking and evasion is not at the whim of wants and desires. It is a kind of a process in and of itself that can maybe interact with these things, but it isn't beholden to them
I would
necessarily.
I would say rather than it being your thought or evasion is at the mercy of your whims, it's completely the other way around. What you feel should be the case. What your emotions are is determined by previous thought and evasion.
Okay. That's interesting. So how do we establish the so would we agree that hunger is both a physiological phenomenon and also can be a desire of the mind, to eat, to want to eat?
Sure, you can want to, you could maybe perceive like the actual physiological like data that you're getting in
Hmm.
as being an uneasiness, right? And you could want to redress that by, eating something.
Okay, so wouldn't that be an example of it not being based on prior patterns of thought and evasion? Like that, this seems to be a direct phenomenon from the physiology, right?
Well, it would be based on prior thought innovation, like as I mentioned, like those monks, right? If you're an ascetic and you think you follow on from Plato and you think this world is bad and that you should try and live as close to death as possible, it may very well may be the case that you experience great hunger and you're like, great, fantastic, I'm suffering, I love this, right? Some people love that. Maybe you're on a hunger strike and you're like, wow, I sure am really hungry. This is probably achieving my goals, right?
Yeah, I think I guess I don't see why I couldn't explain that as just holding a higher desire, even if so okay, maybe this is important. I don't want to say that all desires are automatic in the sense that through thought we cannot come up with new desires. I think that most of everything we're doing right now is a desire that was brought about by thought. At some point we decided, like, hey, I want to read a whole bunch of philosophy books, and and have very little people to speak to in the real world about these things. Um, that was a desire we came to via thought. So I guess the problem for me is in this example that I think with the hunger, the root cause of the hunger is not this. What? How about this? Even if I really want to make sure I don't rephrase this because it's very important. Even if they came to think a desire of not eating for whatever reason, for protest, for spiritual enlightenment, whatever their reasons are that they constructed this desire through their thought. Um, and I know I know I'm using a lot of free will terminology here. It just makes it a lot easier to communicate because this is how we think.
Hmm.
Um, but the why couldn't we explain the desire for hunger as the direct result of the physiology and their decision to not eat as a desire already laden based on their thought as well? So rather than thinking about these things in terms of prior thinking or evasion, we think of them as establishing desires into the overall hierarchy.
Well, I would say, you know, hunger as a pure physiological, input into your brain. I wouldn't really class that as an emotion. It's more like a perception. Like, seeing isn't an emotion, and neither would hunger on this model. But the desire to eat, based upon the perception that your stomach is empty, that would be an emotion, right? I suppose. Maybe that's a little bit of weird usage of emotion, but I think it would work fine enough here.
Yeah, this is just as a slight side note. This is why I like thinking of desire. I think want is a little easier to put as emotion, just but people conflate these terms very often. I really like to think of desire as mental operators rather than like on the same category of like being happy or being sad or something like that. Because these are essentially like we could think of them as like stored values that we call upon in order to help us make decisions. In order when we're engaged in thought, or actually even in impulse in some cases. But um, for what we're concerned about, this hierarchy of desires is what motivates the action, rather than like is a feel per se. Does that make any sense? Like we can communicate these and like I desire this, but what we're trying to communicate is we have a we have a compulsion towards action on because of this.
Well, I would disagree that that is a correct model then, because I don't think these like perceptual inputs, we could call them, like these motivators, right? Like hunger, like sight, like all these different things. I don't think these do mechanistically drive you towards some specific choice. I think it's not automatic. The job of consciousness, you need to specifically choose whether or not to focus on a given perception that you're having, and whether to integrate it correctly with the rest of the base of your knowledge. Right, that's a choice. That doesn't happen automatically. That's like the real meat and potatoes of the objectivist theory of free will, is that consciousness is not automatic. You have to deliberately focus on some specific perception you have. Like the inputs are there. The inputs aren't deterministically being combined by some function. You need to deliberately either integrate them correctly or, just completely ignore them, or place some other consideration higher than those inputs, which would be evasion.
Okay. I said something in passing that I thought we agreed on, but maybe not, and this might help me understand a little bit better. I just kind of made the passing statement that like, hey, action has to be rooted in some form or another in desire. Otherwise, we don't have action, right? Like if there were no desires whatsoever in the mind, there could be no purposeful action because these that's what the operator is for. The desire operator is to motivate action in the human mind. Is that something we agree on?
Yeah, yeah. If you had no desires, as you're calling them, or like perceptions, as I'm calling them, if you had none of these inputs into your mind, then you wouldn't have any choice of over how you're going to integrate these inputs, right? You need the inputs first. I would agree there.
Okay. So I'm sorry. I really so the way that I'm thinking about this is kind of it's a bit of a bastardization, but I think it's something that maybe a lot of the people in the audience could agree with. It's Mises' human action theory relies a lot on subjective preference in order to help understand the motivating force for people in economic systems, right? And I think this understanding via economics is a useful comparison tool in order for how a lot of determinists, myself included, believe that action is brought about via the mind, and if all actions are fundamentally beholden to some set of desires that you are going to hold, you can't have there's going to be a necessary limit on volition that kind of constrains the idea of free will in a very specific way, to where you can only will in ways that you already desire. And we kind of bring ourselves back to the infinite regress problem. But just what do you think about that for now?
Um, well, first I would need to like clarify, by limit on volition, do you mean that volition is like limited to zero, or there is still some volition?
Well, right. Like, let's say I grant everything else, just for the sake of the argument. Just with this understanding of how volition and desire relate, there would have to be like you couldn't at any one given moment use volition for an infinite number of things. It would only be towards the things that you hold desire for, or perception, if we want to use your term.
Yeah, yeah. You in the economic sense, you can only pursue uh, those things that you value, right? In the economic sense, and I would say that volition is indeed limited, because you only have basically three choices: whether to think, whether to you can focus or drift, and you can place your focus towards thinking or evasion. Right? Those are basically your three options.
So this is an original thought, so feel free to shoot me down if I'm completely off base. But have we put ourselves into a bit of a chicken and egg problem, to where desire constrains volition, but we need volition in order to establish desires? Which came first? Where was the first desire?
Um, so I wouldn't say so. The way I'm understanding your notion of desire is that it is the sort of sensory inputs. It's stuff like literally feeling hungry because your nerves are indicating that, like feeling nauseous because your nerves are indicating that, like seeing a cup of tea, stuff like that. Like that, like it's the perceptual inputs that are going into your brain. So they don't constrain your volition really. They just make possible that you have volition. Because if you have no inputs, if you have no perception at all, from birth or something, then you couldn't ever think about anything because you have nothing to integrate. You couldn't consider any previous sense data either because you have no previous sense data. You have nothing that you could do if you have no sensory input. So in that sense, it constrains it. But then once you have the sensory input and you have your conceptual faculty, you can begin choosing how you're going to integrate this sensory data. Are you going to just let it flow over you and you're not going to pay attention? Are you going to place some desire higher than some sort of side constraint on it, where you're going to incorrectly integrate the sense data, or are you going to correctly integrate it? That's those are your options. Given you have these sensory inputs, these desires, how are you going to deal with them? That is where free will lies.
Okay. Just a real quick side question. Are you a rationalist or an empiricist, generally speaking?
I would reject. I would not be either of them, I suppose, in terms of using those terms in as they have been in the history of philosophy. I would be an objectivist. So I can't remember what exactly it was that they question. Like they both accept some premise, which is false, but I can't remember what it is off the top of my head. Like I could look it up because I've got it noted down for my course on the matter, but I can't remember off the top of my head. But I remember there's some error they both make. Like they both, it's like the subjectivism versus intrinsicism thing. Like some of them think that you can't trust your senses right at all. It's something to do with that. I can't remember off the top of my head. I apologize.
Okay,
But I wouldn't
no,
be
that's
either.
fine. It's more of a tangential thing. There's really like 2 points, and this could be my fault. I may not be selling the idea very well, but just kind of like on your recap of how I presented desires, I would say that the sense data that we receive, just to try to make the example as explicit as possible to constrain it a little, the sense data that we receive as hunger is not the desire in itself, but directly corresponds to kind of like what I said earlier, this like stored value that we then later use in our kind of like hierarchical evaluation of our desires. So the desires are not the sense data themselves, because even just going off of like the human action theory we were talking about earlier, like sense data alone is not going to be enough to like motivate any action, right? Like there's sense data is raw. It comes with, well, we may disagree with this based on your objectivist background, but from my perspective, and just to casually throw it out there, I don't think sense data necessarily comes with any oughts as far as human action is concerned. As far as like what I ought to do or want to do at any given moment, like I can see a cup, but I'm going to need some other motivating factor, like to stay alive, for me to drink the water. That motivating factor, that the mental unit that we're using to process the sense data in a way that gives us action is what, or even a better way, allows us to act in accordance with sense data to achieve some kind of goal, is what I would call the desire. But I'll get to the second thing in a second. I'll let you, if you have any thoughts on that.
So is desire, is that a set which corresponds to both these perceptual inputs and the emotions then?
I, again, I kind of want to fight on the term emotion, but as long as we're not saying emotion in like a flippant way, like I'm sad or I'm happy. I think these are much more like fleeting and very they're very
I suppose we
emotion
could use
emotions, if that makes
ends. Like,
sense.
does that work better if like it's things you want or
Yeah,
values in the economic
essentially.
sense?
Like, yeah, like a value is a good way of thinking about a desire. Like these are values that you hold that are in a rank ordered hierarchy, and these hierarchies can change, by the way. But these are not rigid hierarchies. But typically, most people have something like the value to stay alive, very top of their list of desires, or values. I actually kind of like using values in this context because I think, you know, we could just abandon desires for now and communicate the same ideas. But we have this value to stay alive, which informs based on some impulse that we've gotten that we wanted to eat. Oh, I should eat something. There's a cheeseburger. Let me perform action to I don't want to say instantiate, to make real this value that I have essentially. Um,
Sure. So then I can't remember how we got into, because I remember you bringing up like the actual like physiological basis of feeling hungry as a counterexample to choosing your desires, because I think that's what it is. I was saying that, well, you choose these values. These values are determined by your prior choice to think or evade or drift, right? Uh, and then you used a counterexample. I believe this is the case. That, well, you can actually like feel hungry. You actually have a physiological basis for your hunger. Like, am I remember that correctly?
yeah, I think so. The point that I was trying to get across is that the idea the idea is that dang it, it's right on the tip of my tongue. I'm sorry. This
No worries.
the idea is that the desire for to eat didn't come from nowhere. It came from the physiological response. Like we didn't will the desire to eat into existence. We didn't like through volition create the desire to eat. And these two, I'm sorry, I said I would use values earlier. These two values interact in a way that leads us to the conclusion of we should eat if we want these values to mean anything. We hold them for a reason. We're going to act upon them. So we could say like, I won't obfuscate the idea anymore. But does that make any sense?
Sure. I would say that like I would view like the actual like physical sensation of hunger. I would view that as a like as a sense input. Like you couldn't have a desire to climb some mountain without first seeing that mountain, right? You could have some like vague desire that I want to climb some mountain, you know, uh, but without actually having the sensory
Yeah,
input of a mountain, you couldn't decide I want to climb that specific mountain.
I think that's fair. Like yeah, like there would be. It's kind of like working both ways. We can't get action just from like if we were valueless, blank slates. I don't see how we would get action from just observation, even if we were to be hungry, right? If we didn't have a value to do any action on that, it wouldn't matter, right? And I could see the same thing for if we were like ephemeral beings in a world with no sense data. All of our values would be inactionable because there would be nothing to do with them, right? We wouldn't have anything to operate with. Um, so yeah, I don't really see these as mutually exclusive ideas. Just to make sure that's clear.
Sure, but then on this, like, I don't think you are choosing, like, obviously your actual sensation of hunger doesn't come from prior thought or evasion, but how you choose to integrate that sensory input that does that is going to be informed by your whether you're thinking or evading. That is the choice. How you choose to integrate the sensory inputs.
How you choose to integrate them is your choice. So are you saying like whether or not you are going to act on them?
Um, I think action is kind of downstream of this. Um, it's how you are going to like, uh, whether or not you are going to integrate it into your, domain of understanding, and how you're going to integrate it. Like whether or not you're going to integrate it with some side constraint, which is irrelevant, like some out of context desire or something. That would be evasion, or whether you're going to integrate it correctly. And if you integrate it correctly, this will inform how you're going to act, right? Because you're going to act based upon your entire domain of understanding, I would say.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that last part. That Um, Certainly, no value is independent of the context of all of them, or desire or whatever. Value. I'm going to stick with value. That's what I said I would use. um, I guess. Okay, so I feel like we're kind of spinning our wheels here a little bit, but I'm trying to figure out if there's a way that I can, without just saying the same thing over again, that might help to bridge
Yeah, I'm
some of the
not sure
disagreements
how,
that we're having.
because there is maybe something here, but I'm not
I
entirely
think we're
sure.
teasing at something.
Yeah. Um, I'm looking through my notes and there isn't really anything which I had to bring up which hasn't been sort of addressed. But I'm not sure how we can move past the block. I would agree with you.
Okay, how about this? Let's try. We rewound a little bit last time. There was something specific. It actually is what motivated the rationalist question from me, and it's coming back to this chicken and egg of desires, basically, right? And one of the reasons I asked whether or not you're a rationalist is because a rationalist could easily explain this away by saying, like, oh, yeah, we have like some innate set of values that is just imprinted on us from the beginning. This would be a hard rationalist, and a hard empiricist would say, no, we don't have any of that. We acquire all of that through sense data. I think that has massive issues as well. But if we were to, if we are to think of this relation between values and thought as one that is both, they're not, I want to say biconditional. That's not it. They're like a comorbidity almost, right? Like thought motivates values, values can motivate thought, etc. I mean, what's your position on this? Would you say that we have like some innate, immediate values that thought then can interact with?
Well, I would say definitely no. I would definitely come more on the empiricist side because I don't think I think man is born tabula rasa. You would gain
Okay.
all knowledge through sense data fundamentally.
So then how do we come to action without some sort of, so okay, so this, uh, just to recap again, something that I said, another thing I said in passing was this idea that, like, I don't think with just observations like tabula rasa that we could come to any sort of action. We wouldn't have anything to motivate us towards action. Even with like even if we had a concept of a will, that will has to engage with it for a reason, right? So how do we explain that as far as like an infant, infant into toddler? How do you develop the capacity for intentional action?
Well, I mean, they would develop it by they're the second they're born, they're being constantly blasted with all sensory information, and at some point they develop a conceptual faculty to integrate all of this information that they're being bombarded with, right? And at that point, when they have this conceptual faculty, they have reason. They can choose how to wield it. So I'd say that's how it occurs.
But I guess what's the motivating factor behind the choice? What causes you? So like I'm thinking, I'm tapping a little bit into some non-directly applicable philosophy, but like Fichte, are you familiar with him at all? Or Fichte, if you would prefer, Gottlieb?
I am not.
Okay, well, it's not really that important. He's an idealist. He had some pretty interesting ideas if you like history philosophy for the sake of it. But one of the claims that he makes is like you have to have free will because he was fundamentally an idealist, but he had some empiricist leanings as far as what we are as conscious beings is essentially tabula rasa minus some very fundamental components that are non-actionable in themselves. So you need free will in total, true libertarian, non-causal, outside of this universe free will in order to motivate the first action in order to get this chain of events running. So like free will as the first cause in this case. And it's not one to one. I don't want to make it sound like I'm projecting this onto you, but I'm hearing something kind of similar to that as far as like the will it gets this sense data and it as its own first cause without any necessary underpinnings to motivate action acts or thinks if we'd like to keep it constrained.
Well, I suppose the underlying cause would be the nature of the entity which is choosing, right? It's the human brain, which is, and in the development of this conceptual faculty, it's in its nature to be able to choose. I would say that's the underlying cause. The causality is still, compatible. It doesn't come out of nowhere.
Yeah. Sorry. Yeah, just to be clear, I didn't want to project like, all of that onto you, just more so the concept that he was getting at, that there had to be like choice as its choice. Essentially there's a super charitable way where it's like you could even say he was just too early to come up with an idea like like you were saying. But the I guess it seemed earlier, and maybe I'm just wrong here, but it seemed earlier that we agreed that these values are what when we came to this chicken and egg problem. It seemed like we were in agreement that the values are what guide and direct thought into being something that is ultimately actionable. And so, if we're going to say that to choose, okay, how about this? Maybe I can try to steel man a little bit because I feel like I'm just rambling at this point. Is your position that the choice is just a function of the human brain as we see it? It's part of its nature, and so we choose things, and through this choosing, this is how we establish values that then become what we would consider like intentional action.
Yeah.
Okay, that's interesting. That's interesting because I guess one thing to that's credit is that could help explain. It could help explain like a toddler why they aren't capable of intentional action, right? They just haven't arbitrarily choiced enough to establish values that can inform intentional action. Okay, I mean, I just I think that's a satisfactory answer to the chicken and egg problem. So I guess we could say that there is this, but I don't know if that necessarily. This is
Sorry, excuse me.
There's a lot of interworking concepts going on here.
Sorry, I drank some beer and it went down the wrong pipe.
No, you're all right. You're right. There's a lot of interworking parts going on here, so excuse me for constantly tripping myself up because I'm getting like thought after thought, and they keep wanting to. My value hierarchies are getting interrupted as we speak.
Yeah.
But this, I think it's an interesting idea. But that would. Here's an interesting question. Okay, just to push this because this is a really interesting idea to me. So this idea of tabula rasa with choice that is just kind of like, I don't want to say arbitrarily. Is that fair? A fair characterization? Like without values, the choice would just kind of be arbitrarily done.
Well, I would say like the values in general aren't what is determining the choice necessarily. Right? It's I think the choice is at the root level. The choice determines what you are pursuing, right? It is not the other way around.
Yeah, see, I thought we I sorry, excuse me, but I thought we agreed again on this idea of values being what motivates intentional action, and choice is just upon those things.
I would say
But
your values do motivate your actions, but the values that you hold come from your prior thought or evasion.
hmm,
Also, I need to go to the toilet, so I would say either if we have more to talk about, we can talk about it more, or we could wrap it up because either way, I need to go to the toilet.
well, how are you feeling? Do you want to keep going, or do you think we've done enough for now?
I think we've probably done enough. I mean, it's an hour and a half. I think that's a decent amount to chew on.
Yeah, and we've gotten to the point now to where, there's a lot of stuff going on, so I have to really think about these things.
Yeah. Anyway, thanks for coming on, man.
Yeah, it was fun.
Yeah.
Pleasure speaking to you. Hopefully maybe
Yeah.
we'll have some stuff to argue about again in the future.
Indeed. Do you have like a YouTube channel to shout out or anything?
Yeah, I co-host on Disenthrall with Patrick. That's you can go to disenthrall.me/platforms for all the stuff there, and yeah, you can check out all of our stuff. We've got some things coming out in the future, so
Cool. Yeah, thanks for coming on, man.
no problem.
See ya. And end stream. Boop.